This week, Dimitri Sirota from BigID is with us to discuss the evolution of data security. Then Kiran Chinaganagari from Securin and Jeff Smith from Farmington Municipal Schools joins us to talk about cybersecurity in K-12 schools. Finally, in the enterprise security news, Darktrace, Simulate, and Tidal Cyber do acquisitions, orchestration and automation, AI voice changes, new ransomware tactics in the cloud. It's 2025. Do you know what's running on your network? It's 2025. Time to talk about resilience. WordPress news gets even crazier. Hacklore. Linus Torvalds builds you a distortion pedal so you can shred. And Enron is back, baby. All that and more in this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Graylog elevates enterprise-level cybersecurity through its comprehensive SIEM, centralized log management, and API security solutions. Built on the Graylog platform, Graylog Security combines SIEM, security analytics, threat detection, and incident response capabilities. Unlike traditional SIEMs, which offer complex and costly setups, Graylog Security simplifies security and operational challenges with an optimal blend of licensing, people, and infrastructure costs. To see a demo, visit securityweekly.com/Graylog. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Nothing Day. This is episode 390, recorded on Thursday, January 16th, 2025. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the Admiral of ASPM, the Captain of Content, the Genie of Google Gemini, Katie Teitler-Santula. How are you doing, Katie?
I'm fine, but that last distinction only comes as of our mutual friend, Tyler, who is no longer hosting with us. But for any of you listening, if you need some deep research in a hurry, deep research on Gemini is the way to go.
Yeah, we just learned that they have this deep research model, and it really goes deep on whatever you ask it to do. So it's we're learning some new stuff from Mr. Tyler Shields, even though he is no longer on the show.
Yeah, it was amazing. I was asked to pull something together yesterday in typical, startup fashion. And I needed sources for about 10 companies that probably, if I had been doing it manual, would have taken me the better part of a week to go that deep. But one nice little prompt, and within, I would say, 10 to 12 minutes, I had all the sources I needed to go through. It was amazing.
Yeah. I tried with your same prompt and was pretty impressed with the output. It's coming close to the kind of research that I do myself manually, and if it can save me all that visiting websites and scraping websites time to compare different products, that's going to be amazing for sure.
I would only change one thing you said, that is, instead of I do, I did, because I will no longer do that same thing. It is past tense in my book now that we have this amazing tool.
So you did not hear that wrong. It is National Nothing Day. We pull a silly national day from these websites that list such things, and it's somewhat ironic that this observance was created as a day to provide Americans with one national day when they can just sit without celebrating, observing, or honoring anything. And the irony is it's also Get to Know Your Customers Day, National Without a Scalpel Day, National Fig Newton Day.
Oh.
Complete coincidence. I was chewing on one here. And National Religious Freedom Day. So it's not nothing today.
It's not nothing.
Still some silly stuff.
Yes.
So this first interview is sponsored by BigID. Today's topic is the next era in data security, and we're excited to have Dimitri Sirota, CEO and co-founder of BigID, with us today. Welcome, Dimitri.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. For sure. So yeah, this is a very interesting topic to me. When I was a industry analyst, I used to say that data security would be one of the final frontiers that we cover because it's so difficult to manage data, to secure data. Anytime you attach controls to it, it gets more difficult to work with. Trying to discover it, to classify it, all that stuff are very hard problems. And yeah, it's always enlightening to kind of jump in and see where what the current state of data security is like. And certainly with the advent of AI, we've seen another big push here, right? Both with machine learning models, machine learning classifiers, and some generative AI used here as well. So let's maybe start there. Like, how much of this you've been in this for a while now, right? You can remember before ChatGPT was a thing, and probably before the ML, before we started seeing a lot of use of that instead of regex and things like that for classifying and finding data. How much hype is there? How deep is that hype, and how much of it is just same challenges, different day?
So look, I think let's maybe take a step back. I think data has a lot more attention today for a couple of reasons, and kind of a number of secular trends. I'll kind of highlight maybe for the audience. So one is not necessarily the technology that backends it, but the technology that drives it. So you talked about Gemini, and Gemini is a type of large language model, and Gen AI. And if companies want to use co-pilots for Microsoft or Gemini, or if they want to be able to train their own models, that means they need to know what data they could use to feed their models. So Gen AI, and remember, Gen AI is generative, and it's all about generating content from content. Means I got to know my content. I got to know what files I have, what emails I have, what chats I have, what code I have. So if I want to build an agent to go coding, I need to be able to understand and classify and categorize my so Gen AI is one driver. Cloud is another, right? More and more companies are pushing their data center data into the cloud. In the cloud, I don't have any hard boundaries. And in the cloud, I have data stores like object stores, S3, GCS, where the data is a little bit unstructured, a little bit structured. So it's a mingle. So cloud is another big push. Regulation. So, ironically, if you look at the old DLP technologies like semantic Montu, they were a response to regulations like PCI for payment cards. So for those in your audience, when e-commerce was a new thing, they wanted to regulate how companies handled credit cards. Well, fast forward today, there's countless regulations around data. There's HIPAA and PCI, but there's also GDPR. I think there's like 200 privacy regulations, 13 in the US alone. And then there's others. There's data sovereignty regulations. There's ITAR. And then lastly, I think, anybody that reads a newspaper knows that data breaches are still in the news, whether it's ransomware or exfiltration, whether it's done by a criminal gang or a nation state actor. You hear it all the time, right? We heard about it from the telcos recently. It's a big deal. So that puts data at the center, right? It's at the nexus of these four kind of macro trends. And the other challenge is data is getting created at a pace that's never been seen, right? Petabytes every day for every company, because so much of what we do is interactive online that generates data. Machines now generate data, whether it's AI. AI is generating data, SIMs and log. So data is getting generated at such huge volumes. So it creates challenges. So I would say new tailwinds or headwinds, depending on how you want to describe it. Lots of volume, lots of velocity in terms of the creation of the data. And then at the same time, data has never been more important from a value standpoint. So the question becomes for companies is, I need to know my data because I want to drive BI, business intelligence, AI, artificial intelligence, customer personalization, things of that sort. But the same data that I use to create value, those crown jewels, is the data that represents risk to me. And that risk could be security risk, inside or outside, or it could also be regulatory risk. And so how do I deal with all of that altogether?
Right. Yeah, and we see this everywhere. Is it okay if we record this meeting? Is it okay if I generate a transcript from this meeting? The interesting thing about the new data being generated, and I was chatting with somebody earlier today about this, is it's really easy to forget that you're doing it. To flip on the switch, it says always record every meeting, always transcribe it. and maybe it doesn't occur to you when you're in a meeting where somebody says, "Can this be under FriendDA or it's under NDA or something like that?"
Yep.
Now you've got some privileged information or something like that sitting in a chat log somewhere, and accessible probably to people other than yourself. So, that I think that's one of the really interesting things now is more than ever, data is being like driving a car. Data is being generated at this massive rate, and we don't have a whole lot of transparency in many cases into what's being generated, where it's being stored, what our controls are over it.
Yeah, yeah. Look, and I think the tools that people built for the data center before the age of privacy, before the age of AI, are not necessarily the same tools that you're going to use in this kind of fast forward period where the velocity, variety, and volume of data is getting generated in the cloud at unprecedented paces. And so again, it creates an opportunity for vendors like BigID to come in, reimagine, deal with not terabytes of data, but petabytes and exabytes of data, and again of a very, very wide variety and pedigree.
Yeah. So yeah. So where do we go from here? I guess like let's you mentioned all the regulations, 200 laws, around, and just the fact that when we talk about breaches, often that word data is attached to that term, right?
Yeah.
Not every breach is a data breach. Occasionally, we see attackers go after manufacturing operations, stuff like that. They're not stealing data, but the vast majority of them they do. So what are you seeing with customers with how the data security industry is evolving here? You mentioned at the beginning, PCI was one of those, and I think it was breaches, right? We formed the card brands formed this kind of independent body, the PCI Council, to avoid laws being created to govern over this. They said, "No, we've got it. You don't have to create a bunch of laws. We can regulate ourselves," and that's where PCI came from.
Yeah.
So, what's driving it today? What is it? Is it still again all regulation, or is it the breaches themselves?
So look, I think it's a mix, right? So clearly, breaches and ransomware and anything that impacts and exfiltrates data is a consideration. I think today there's a myriad of reasons. Like I said, there's regulatory, there's security breach as an example. Whether it's a employee who goes rogue and tries to take some stuff to a competitor, or whether it's a nation state actor or a criminal gang. The shift to the cloud, so you're dealing with volume and variety of data, and then obviously AI. Those are all drivers, motivators. What happens in response is companies go, okay, now I really need to know, where do I have sensitive data? Where are my crown jewels, right? And so you hear companies talk about crown jewel programs. They need to know, where do I have my schematics for a missile, my recipe for my new food item, personal data that belongs to my employees or customers. So they need to be able to locate that data. And so the priority becomes, how do I understand my data? The visibility I think you referred to or alluded to earlier. How do I get visibility when I'm looking at unstructured files and emails and chats, structured databases, things that kind of are NoSQL and a little bit in between? So you need to find all that. And then the second prerogative, once you kind of find the data, if you find it and kind of call it a day, then all you've done is create a liability for yourself. You've taken that asset and kind of exposed it to your board of directors and said, ta-da, here's where we have risk, but I can't do anything about it. And so the next part, after you kind of know the data, you got to fix the risk, right? You got to figure out, where do you have risk and how do you repair it? And that requires remediation, that requires retention, that requires risk reduction. And so I think you have this kind of yin yang of being able to more adequately find all your data at risk, so that crown jewel data. And then secondly, wherever that data is, whether it's in a S3 bucket or whether it's in a Databricks data lake, or whether it's in Salesforce, or whether it's in a mainframe, you want to be able to kind of repair it. So that could be deleted, that could be encrypting it, that could be putting access controls around it.
We talked about, or you talked about, macro changes a few minutes ago, but data is really hard. What are the current technologies or processes? What are the things that are allowing us to be better at it now than we were 5, 10, 15 years ago? What is helping this, and where do we go from here? Because I expect data to continuously be a challenge, which means you always have a job. But
Yeah, yeah.
but where does it go, and what's helping us improve today here in 2025 versus a little bit ago?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I think the pace of data creation, the volume, the velocity, the variety has never equal to where we are today, right? I think we're doubling the amount of data in the world on a biannual basis now. So again, huge pace. But that also means the tooling that you need to be able to deal with that kind of volume, variety, and velocity is changing. So there, Adrian, you kind of talked about AI and machine learning. So clearly, if you go back to kind of the early days of semantic and DLP, it was exclusively pattern based because that was the state of the art. Today, you have a variety of machine learning and Gen AI approaches. It's not a one size fits all. Some are better at some things, others are better at other things. But you have technologies like graph, which is great if you want to be able to locate data that belongs to a person. So I want to identify data or classify data by person. You have things like LLM, which is great for some things, but not for other things, because LLMs are not trained on sensitive data. They're trained on Reddit and X.com and Facebook. So they're fantastic if you want to be able to just loosely describe something and then have the machine learning kind of come back to you with some recommendations. You have other technologies like cluster analysis, like natural language processing. So I think the range of machine learning and AI technology has broadened, and that provides more tooling for identifying, classifying, categorizing, and even contextualizing data. So that's changed. The compute has also changed, right? So historically, you ran your discovery on a server, and servers required you to stack them up and wiring closets and cabling. Now it's almost kind of virtual. You could take advantage of the cloud to scale laterally. Um, and just even the cloud architecture, the microservice, some of your audience may be familiar. So I think the technology to identify the data over the last year, whether you call it AI or ML, has broadened and has widened the kinds of data and the kinds of use cases you could support. The compute has improved, but also the ability to build actions, right? The ability to build a platform. If you want to build a platform, you need an application ecosystem. You need to add modules, but you don't want those modules to feel monolithic. You don't want it to feel clunky. You want it to feel seamless. You want it to feel like your iPhone. And so the technology to build that, so if you want to layer on access or remediation or retention or privacy, you could do it in a logical, seamless way so that people could kind of grow into the solution. Just like you could start with talk and text on your phone, but if you want to start ordering food from Uber Eats, you can. If you want to start doing banking with JPMC, you can. So all of that is new, and that begets brand new acronyms for data security. So where we had DLP and maybe data access governance or DAG, and things like data activity monitoring, like DAM, you now have DSPM. And then more broadly, I think the cool kids are referring to DSP, data security platform, which encompasses all of the above, right? Which says, okay, data's at the center, and I'm going to have DAG and DLM and DSPM and all the 3 and 4 letter acronyms I could make up.
And so when we're talking about data security, there are so many layers. And it's really, really complicated now that we have AI and LLMs, and we've already seen some companies saying that they're going to roll back their fact checking. This is a little bit of a different view of data and data security, but how do we combat that? Is there a way with these tools to not only protect the data, but protect the data that is right and correct, and then identify data that might be misleading or completely false or made up intentionally? How are we going to handle these problems? And is it somehow integrated?
Yeah. So look, I think BigID talks a lot about, so obviously, if you look at the mechanics, we could find the data, we could remove the risk around the data through remediation, et cetera. But when you're talking about AI, let me kind of take one step back and kind of just level set for your audience, or set the table, if you will. Most companies are not building foundation models. You talked about Gemini. That's something Google did, right? Facebook, you talked about the kind of checks. They built an open source model called Llama. Microsoft is collaborating on Azure GPT with OpenAI, right? Other companies like Amazon are partnering with Claude, Anthropic. They're building foundation models because they have billions of dollars from VCs. That money goes to NVIDIA. It buys a bunch of GPUs, and you could train your model on text, on images, etc. Your local company, and that includes like the premier companies in the Fortune 500, they're not doing that. That's a very expensive proposition. So all they're doing is basically fine tuning those existing commercial models with their data. They're basically enriching that. So the only lever that these companies have is the data, right? They're not building the foundation model.
Right.
They're basically retraining the foundation model on their data. And this way they could build an AI agent that could do support on, a bank, or support on a plane. So what does that mean? It means that if those companies want to build trustful AI, they need to be able to understand and trust the data that goes into AI, because the data is really the only input point, right? That's the fulcrum, that's the lever. And so how do they trust it? So one is they need to know whether the data changes. They need to know where the data came from. They need to know whether the data has any particularly toxic information or biased information, right? Whether it's ethnicity, religion, et cetera. So I think that there's a whole family of things you could do to trust your data so that your customers could trust the AI that you generate with that data. And so that requires a certain depth of domain and things like unstructured files, emails, chats. It requires a certain AI that we use in BigID to help understand if there's bias, if there's toxicity, to understand where the data came from and who the data belongs to. But at the end of the day, foundationally, in answer to your question, companies want their customers and their employees to trust the AI that they generate from their data. And therefore, they themselves need to be able to trust the data and ensure the integrity of the data and the compliance and legality of the data.
And it seems that there's kind of a tug of war going on, this kind of duality of different motivators for businesses right now, where on the one side, I hear people saying data is the new gold, because you need data to train these models. For these large language models, you need large amounts of different kinds of data for them to be able to do what they do. And then on the other side, I hear people saying, no, actually, maybe gold isn't the right element to associate with this. Maybe it's uranium. It's still valuable. It's still a very valuable
It's
element.
radioactive.
But yes, it is also a liability, right? When I look at most of the fines that SEC and FTC and their complaints are handing out, a lot of it's for companies that are storing too much data on their customers, gathering too much data, and keeping it for too long when they shouldn't be keeping it. So there's this. That's why I say there's this kind of duality where companies are incentivized to collect all this data because they can make money off the data. The data is potentially an additional paycheck on top of whatever they're doing, particularly for any free services out there, right? This tends to be how they're paying for those free services, consumer services. And then on the other side, there's someone else within that same company saying, no, we need to, we need to make sure we're not going to get in trouble for storing all this data and get rid of it. So are those common use cases you're seeing where, clearly for GDPR, things like that, and CPRA, the right to delete my data at an organization, they need to have the ability to do that. But how often do you see companies eager to get rid of data that they figure that out, right? Like the first thing before you get rid of it, you want to make sure you don't delete stuff you need.
I kind of feel like first we need to establish where in the periodic table is data.
It's a really heavy element. I'm going to say that it's down near the bottom.
Boron. No. So look, I think let me kind of maybe speak to kind of your characterization as data as kind of fuel. I think the one analogy people use is oil, right? Because data powers the digital enterprise, and so it's the fuel that you need to drive, personalization, e-commerce, AI, et cetera. And that is correct. Obviously, it's correct. But oil is fungible, right? You can put it in a barrel, you could send it here, you could send it there to a refinery. It's kind of swappable. Data is not, right? Your data, Katie's data, my data, it's different, right? We live in different places. Our names are different. We have different occupations. We have different histories and backgrounds. So our data is not swappable, right? Like a bucket of oil is. And that also makes it problematic because anything dealing with people, intellectual property, financial information, health information is regulated. And so you have a higher degree of complexity where, like you say, it can almost feel radioactive. It can feel almost toxic, right? Yes, it's incredibly powerful like oil, but because it's not oil, because it could be personal, because it could be intellectual, because it could be financial, because it could be health related, it's actually very, very separated. It's very legislated, and ultimately very toxic, right? Nobody wants to hear about health records that are stolen from Cerner or something. So, what does that mean? I think it means that companies are trying to be much more responsible in terms of how they collect and how they maintain their data. So, there's regulations like GDPR in Europe. The US has things like CCPA or CPRA in California, but there's versions of that now, and I think a bunch of other states, a dozen other states. And that sets down rules around how you collect data, how you need to be able to respond to data subjects, individuals, employees, or customers that want their data. And yes, that also means that you have to be specific around how you're going to delete the data, right? Because you're not supposed to collect more than you need, and you're not supposed to keep more than you need. And that's smart from a security standpoint because it reduces your attack surface, but it's required from a privacy standpoint. And so, yes, we see everywhere in Europe, in Asia, in the US, in Latin America, a huge upswell of organizations trying to figure out how do I find my duplicate data, my stale data, my rot data, so trivial and redundant, and then how do I manage that cycle where I could have retention schedules, maybe recommend retention schedules. I could review the findings. I found some files or some databases, and then I could execute either an archive to a secondary store in the cloud or just a complete deletion. And like you said, it's actually mandated in privacy regulations like GDPR. They require the ability to delete the data if that's what a customer wants. It's super hard. BigID was one of the pioneers in that area. But yes, we offer it for generic data hygiene, but also for privacy purposes where you want to be able to delete Dimitri's data because Dimitri wants that, but you need to make sure that there's no legal hold on the data, maybe because there's a pending court case. You need to make sure that if you delete Dimitri's data, you're not going to break an application. So BigID manages the entire cycle. So more important, will continue to grow in importance. And generally, good principle is the less data you have, the less data you have to get stolen.
Yeah. And as we wrap up this conversation, Dimitri, I wonder, do you see a future where, maybe this data, the consumer has more control over this data? This is something I've seen pitched before in health records where instead of me paying my provider $10 to take my records from one doctor's office to another, which I don't think they're really allowed to do, but they try to do anyway. It's something that I actually control, that I actually approve their access to my data. My data is something that I can control. I've seen public private key encryption type stuff, and a lot of it's just too heavy handed, too difficult for a consumer to understand how to use, or the recovery of that data. We've seen that with cryptocurrency, right? Like how many people have messed up managing cold wallets and lost all this value in cryptocurrency, and interesting as it is, I didn't think the cryptocurrency fad would inform us about whether or not consumers can manage their own data.
So to some degree, let me kind of maybe respond to you kind of very directly. To some degree, this already exists, right? Regulations like GDPR and CCPA actually mandate it. You have to present consumers. So Google, who was kind of a pioneer in this space, actually presents a really nice facade to consumers where they could say, they could request their data, they can prescribe how they want their data to be used or not used. Some vendors, like BigID as an example, also provides this facility to enterprise customers, right? Me, Mr. Enterprise or Mrs. Enterprise, I want to be able to enable my employees and my consumers to specify what I could do with their data. Could I use it for reporting? Could I use it for commerce? Could I use it for AI? And then having that captured. So BigID already offers that where we could help companies basically manage preferences around data. What's happening now is that consent, and that's usually the kind of term of art. You want to capture the consent, but you want it to propagate. So if you have data in a file system or in a data lake, I can't use this for AI or I can't use this for commercialization. So again, part of what we're doing is pioneering that bridge between the security and compliance or privacy world. So you could manage data from the consumer end where you collect it all the way to where you use it as an enterprise and make sure you don't proverbially step on a snake by using a consumer's data when their intent or purpose is not for you to use it for AI or commerce or something. So yes, that's happening. You will see more of it. And I think part of it is going to be driven again by Gen AI, where you're going to see people just saying, I don't want you to train on my data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're even seeing that in business contracts now. That's becoming like a standard clause in business contracts, which I find unsurprising, but interesting.
Yeah, 100%. My data is mine. Nobody has a right to my data, just like nobody has a right to my body except for me.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, Dimitri, thank you so much for this conversation. I learned a lot in this, and usually I prep for these things. I don't expect to learn a lot during the conversation, but today I have. I even have a new acronym. DSP is a new one for me.
Okay.
So much appreciated.
Yeah, we're back to 3 letters. Thank you for having me again. Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Katie. It was a pleasure.
And make sure you visit securityweekly.com/BigID to learn more. And stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk holistic exposure management with Kiran Chinaganagari from Securin and Jeff Smith from Farmington Municipal Schools. I'm going to say that at least one more time today.